Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. As many of you may know, I have been very interested in transit and infrastructure and what's going on in the Greater Toronto Area in regards to transit. And last week, the Toronto Regional Board of Trade released a report that is absolutely fascinating. Jonathan English, who is the Director of Policy Transportation at the Toronto Region Board of Trade, and the author of a major new report on rail and how we can make better use of our rail network in the Greater Toronto Area, is joining us. Jonathan, how are you? Welcome to our show.
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me on.
So I hear you did a PhD in buses around Toronto. Why would anyone want to do a PhD in buses around Toronto?
Well, it's actually quite interesting. Toronto is the only city, or it was Metro Toronto at that time, that grew transit ridership in all of North America between 1946 and 1970. And I wanted to understand why that was and to see what kind of lessons can be learned from that. And there are actually a lot of lessons that can be learned from that. We're the only city that decided to provide a lot of bus service to newly developing suburbs, more or less as soon as they were built. And everyone expected that nobody would ride them, but surprise, people actually did. So now suburban Toronto, streets like Finch, Lawrence, have some of the busiest bus routes in North America. Finch is busier than all but a handful of routes in New York City.
Really?
So yeah, it's a real success story. We haven't necessarily carried on those lessons, but in that period, we were a real unique story.
Unbelievable. And so what motivated you to write this report on rail and using rail in Toronto?
So I think this is also another one of those kind of hidden opportunities. Toronto has a fantastically well-located rail network, radiating out from the center of the city, but also useful in all the parts of the city and the 905 region. But the problem that we have is simply that it's not being used to anywhere near its potential. It's really oriented towards commuter service to downtown Toronto, which is great. And GO Transit does that very well. And GO has been talking about expanding for a long time. And this report is kind of trying to raise the profile of that work and also trying to bring in lessons from around the world from places that have done this kind of thing frequently and for a very long time and successfully. And see how they can be applied here. This is about running trains all the time in both directions.
So this is, all day, two-way, frequent train service, and it's wider than either current GO or even the talked about regional express rail that GO has been talking about. And it's sort of like I would have thought smart tracks on steroids, because it's sort of taking John Tory's smart tracks idea and applying it for the whole GTA.
Yeah, to some extent, that's a good analogy. It's about the frequent service, but it's also about integrating it with local service, electrified trains, faster, more modern trains. There are a lot of details on that. Adding stations so people can either walk to the station or take the bus to the station more frequently. There are a lot of different details, and because it's such an ambitious project, it's a pretty complicated one.
Do you think it has a chance of getting enacted?
I think that it does, but partly because a lot of the work for it is already underway. GO is already talking expansion, and some of these details as well. They seem to be working on, and the cost of it, when you compare it to the cost of a subway, this is a 450-kilometer network, and building it might cost about as much as one or two 8-kilometer subways or a light rail project. So the cost of it for the scale of the project is so much smaller that I think that it has a real chance.
I think it's an incredibly ambitious plan, and I love it, and I want to delve into it in greater detail. I've gone through it in detail. The report, I think that the examples you use of what has been done in Germany and in France are excellent. I love some of your ideas in regards to adding extra stations downtown Toronto, and I love some of the mid-Toronto corridor ideas that you've got. So we're going to come back after some messages and get into more detail into John English's and the Toronto Region Board of Trade's proposal for a far better rail network in the Greater Toronto Area. Stay with us.
Hello?
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Jonathan English. He is the Director of Transportation Policy at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. And they've just recently come out with a major new report on what to do with our rail corridors around the Greater Toronto Area. And Jonathan, what you're talking about is that, we have this underutilized resource that is really a great opportunity for us, which are all these old passenger and freight rail train tracks that spread out around the city. And it's interesting, you compare some of the routes that go through downtown Toronto, and you compare it to, I guess, Paris and London, which are spending billions of dollars trying to connect the trains that don't go through the major parts of downtown Paris or major parts of downtown London. I think the Crosslink or Crosstown or whatever it's called in London was like $18 billion or 18 billion pounds maybe.
Yeah, that's right.
And so what's the key for your change to Union Station?
So Union Station really is the keystone for all of this. And it's the bottleneck on the network right now. But we're incredibly lucky. Like you said, London is building 2 tracks across the center of the city for 18 billion pounds, whatever it ends up being. Paris has over 50 years built 8 tracks. We already have 10, and we've had them since 1927. So we're incredibly lucky in that respect. The problem is Union Station's platforms are incredibly narrow. The stairs are really narrow. If you've ever taken the GO train, when the GO train empties out, everybody's packed on that platform.
I actually timed myself a few times. It took me more time to get from the middle of the top level of a GO train coming from Clarkson to out on Bay Street than it did to get from Clarkson to downtown.
That's amazing, but I'm not the least bit surprised. That's the bottleneck on the system for train capacity, for passenger capacity, for everything. And so fixing Union Station with wider platforms is critical. But the other problem is we can't continue to pack every single person going to downtown Toronto into Union Station. So adding additional stations, some to connect with the Ontario line, some to, at Exhibition and at East Harbour, which GO is already planning, and Metrolinx, but also additional ones right downtown, like at Spadina, at Sherbourne, and at Cherry Street to serve, the Portlands and the new waterfront development.
Now, all the people coming from, either West Toronto, do they really want to stop again at Spadina and Union, or from East and have, 2 stops coming in?
Well, I think that the great thing about the new trains that we would have is that they're so much faster. I did some analysis, and GO trains are the most underpowered regional trains in the world, as far as I could find. And the problem—
The most underpowered?
Yeah, so very poor acceleration. So the problem with that is that these trains, when they stop at stations, they need a long time to get back up to speed again. Modern trains can get up to speed, when they're electric. It's like a Tesla. You step on the gas or the pedal,
where they go,
and away they go. It's this kind of the same principle. And so they can stop much more frequently and still cover that ground in less time than the current GO trains do.
So you've got an idea here of changing Union Station fairly dramatically with wider platforms. And also, I think the key that you talk about is the trains go through, don't stop and return. And so you've got the Milton line that goes through and continues all the way up to Stouffville. The Lakeshore East goes to Lakeshore West, which it currently does. And then you've got another one that's interesting, that you've got the one that comes from Kitchener comes through and goes somewhere as well.
Yeah. Well, one of the issues is obviously the western part of the GTA is bigger or has a higher population and more tracks than the eastern part. So you have to turn the trains somewhere, but turning trains takes time. So doing it at the scarce Union Station real estate is generally not a good idea. So we thought about the possibility of, some of those trains could run through to other lines, but we thought about the possibility of turning them north, running them up the Don Valley to the area where Metrolinx is already planning a turnaround facility, and you could have a few additional stops then, at least, to distribute that traffic downtown, on the east end of downtown and at Cherry Street as well. So again, it's all about getting as many people as you can off Union Station, and creating more options for trips. so that it's not just that kind of one-way flow.
Right.
Over 90% of GO rail passengers today start or end at Union. And that's
I heard it was like 97%. So that's,
yeah, it's really high.
so I think the other thing that this is predicated on, your plan, is electrification, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Tell us what the benefits of electrification are.
Well, one of the big ones, obviously, is that sort of Tesla performance kind of thing. The much higher performance.
But the benefit of that is what? That you can have shorter headways between the trains, and so therefore more frequent service?
Exactly. When you have higher performance, it's not like starting a car behind a heavily loaded truck. You can that if you try to do that at a red light, the traffic behind you will back up because it'll take them a long time to get up to speed.
Right.
So that's a big capacity limiter. They're also slow to brake, the current trains, but a modern electric train will brake much more quickly. So that's another huge advantage. Obviously, the environmental advantage is huge. All of it has to be done in a way that doesn't interfere with freight, which it can be either through separate tracks or other agreements. But yes, electrification has key performance, environmental. There isn't diesel in the local environment, but also we have a very clean power grid in Ontario. So there isn't overall carbon emissions from using electricity as well.
And then you actually recommend against these double-decker diesel oriented cars that we have today, and you're going with single level cars that appear to have a lot more exit and entry. Why is that?
Yeah, exactly right. You look at Tokyo, right? You think of Tokyo as the most busy, the most extreme system, but even there they go with single level trains. And the reason is that with double-decker trains, you can fit more people, but the sacrifice you make is you've got fewer doors per person. And especially when you've got one really busy station downtown, that becomes a real choke point because the time it takes for people to make it their way down the stairs and to the door and get out the door means a longer time sitting at the platform, which means trains behind you backing up. So the key is always maximum train throughput is a better way, generally speaking, to get capacity than maximum number of people per train. And the other thing is that you can consider modern double-decker trains. Paris has them for a couple routes. For longer distance trips where you really want seats as much as possible, that might make sense. But in general, single level trains, for the demand that we have in Toronto, which is high, but not that high compared to some of these places, is probably the best way to go.
Now, so with electrification and with these single level trains and with all your extra stops, what you're talking about, I think, was fascinating. You want service every 10 minutes, and you actually go through this description of if you have service that is more frequent than 12 minutes, people no longer wait to look for a schedule. They just go to the station. And so therefore it becomes almost like a subway.
Exactly right. That's something that has been researched actually in the kind of transit world quite a bit. And there are a few different figures that people have come up with. 12 minutes is kind of a standard. So, we went with 10 minutes because it's just easy to remember. And the advantage of that is, yeah, people turn up at the station. It's turn up and go. You don't have to worry about a schedule. It's like the subway. And there's no reason, when you look at where these tracks run through, whether it's in Mississauga or in Toronto and Markham, these are densely populated areas. Let's not pretend that they aren't. They're as dense as the area that the Bloor Danforth subway runs through, or most of the subway lines in the city of Toronto. So the demand is there, latent. But the demand, and this is demonstrated all over the world, when you don't have turn up and go service, when people have to look at the schedule or rely on the schedule, demand is way, way, way lower. So it's about getting up to that frequency that people don't have to check the schedule, and demand consistently, and this has been demonstrated around the world, explodes.
We're talking with Jonathan English, the Director of Transportation Policy at the Toronto Region Board of Trade, who's come out with a fascinating report on expanding train service and making it almost like a subway around the whole Greater Toronto area. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Jonathan in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A real pleasure of mine because it's kind of interesting, very interesting, to talk to Jonathan English, who is the Director of Transportation Policy at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. Fascinating guy. He did a PhD on bus lines in the Toronto area. We chatted a little bit about that. But he's come out, and the Toronto Regional Board of Trade has come out with a major report this past week on dramatically expanding regional rail in the Toronto area. And Jonathan, let's continue going through some of the key points of your report, if we could. So another one of them is this 3 more downtown stations, major stations, one at Spadina, another one at Sherbourne, and another one at Cherry. Talk to me about the benefits of that.
So like we mentioned, one of the key challenges is the crowding at Union Station. And if you add more stations downtown, you can spread some of that load out over all stations. Is Union still going to be the busiest? Of course it is. And in the short term, there isn't necessarily as much development around those stations as there is today, but that would very likely change if you could get there from anywhere in the region very quickly, like you can at Union.
Well, and I think of what's going on at Spadina. You've got that, tons of development right there at Spadina in front, and then also you've got the Rogers Stadium and Scotiabank Arena, et cetera. When you think about, people would go 2 directions exiting those major events, and you'd have a ton of connectivity with the streetcar, the LRT that goes up Spadina, wouldn't you?
Yep, absolutely. That's exactly right. And yeah, spreading loads, especially at special events. If the Blue Jays start selling out and you have 40,000 people leaving the Rogers Center at the same time, wouldn't it be helpful to have them going, in 2 directions to 2 different stations?
And then Sherbourne and Cherry.
Yeah, so there's a lot of development going on around the waterfront. Those areas are targeted for massive intensification. This would bring a rail station basically to the doorstep of those intensifying waterfront neighborhoods. And Cherry, the additional advantage is there's actually a lot of room there. So we could create space for trains to turn around to go back west without using up space at Union Station where space is more limited.
And you've got the connectivity to the Distillery District, which their biggest challenge is parking. And growth not only with a great retail entertainment district, but a whole bunch of condos being built there.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. And
one of the other things that I find interesting about your proposal is the number of new stations that you've got.
Yeah, well, so, one of the huge advantages of, like I said, the modern electric trains is that you can stop them more frequently without actually adding travel time compared to what we have today. So, the map you can see here is really highlighting a sort of ultimate scenario, and we can go into the challenges of implementing that. But regardless, we can add a lot of stations so that people can get closer to where they actually want to go or be able to walk to the station.
So let's talk about some of them just for fun of it. Okay, so on the Lakeshore West, you've added a station at Roncesvalles.
Yeah.
And then you've added stations at Cawthra and Winston Churchill.
That's right. Yeah. So the one at Roncesvalles, there actually was a station there once upon a time, and that's been gone for a long time. You can actually still see a staircase there. But that's an area that there's quite a bit of population there. It would connect with multiple streetcar routes. So, there's value in putting a station there if you can, and it helps make it more of a local service. Cawthra, the old Lakeview Power Station, there's a huge development plan there. Cawthra is also a bus route, not the busiest bus route, but it is a bus route. So again, you're improving connectivity there. Same thing with Winston Churchill. You no longer have to all crowd it. Clarkson's one of the busiest stations in the whole network. So rather than having everybody crowd into Clarkson, people can spread out a little bit more.
And if you start to have that number of stations, it becomes, as you said, almost like a subway that people would be, going, right now there's only two stops, I guess, Long Branch and Exhibition between Port Credit and downtown. And here you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stations. between downtown and Port Credit.
There is Mimico now, the two, but yeah, three.
You're right. Okay.
Yeah.
What about that Christie Pitts, area that not Christie Pitts, the Mr. Christie site at Park Lawn? Huge development there, both on the waterfront and with I think a 25-acre redevelopment site. Doesn't that deserve a GO train station?
It definitely does. Yeah, that was a bit of an omission when we were making the maps. But absolutely, I've always been a huge fan of Park Lawn Station. It's one of the most obvious additions in the whole network, given the huge development that has happened and is going to happen there.
Okay, let's talk about the Mississauga Milton line, which really you've identified as one of the biggest opportunity areas because of the way it crosses perpendicularly, sort of on a diagonal, I guess, through Mississauga. And you've added a station at Cawthra and another one at Eglinton, sort of between Arundel and Streetsville, which is kind of interesting. But I got to ask you, so you add one at Cawthra. Why didn't you add one at Sherway?
Well, it's a good question. It doesn't quite hit Sherway directly, so
it's like a quarter of a mile away from Sherway.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think that would be a reasonable place to add a stop as well. There, obviously, to some extent, we created this map of stations so that we could do the timetabling and the isochrone mapping. So there are, it would take a lot of study to figure out exactly where every station should go. But emphasizing, does it connect with a busy bus line? Is there a lot of development there? Those are kind of the two key things to determine a station. And yeah, you're right. There's plenty of development there. And
then with both the line that goes to Kitchener as well as the one that goes to Newmarket and to Barrie, you've got a whole bunch of additional stations within the city of Toronto, comparable to sort of John Tory's Smart Track proposal, correct?
Yep, it's quite similar to that station arrangement, and they are talking about adding stations based on that Smart Track proposal to the GO network. And then I got to tell you, and you say it's not part of your first stage, but it's a longer stage. I love this proposal to use the CP Mid Toronto route as something that goes all the way from, I guess here you've got it from Mayfield, but going across the center of the city between DuPont and Davenport, and stopping at that original train station that's been turned into an LCBO at Summerhill on the Yonge subway line. Mm-hmm. Well, the challenge on that line is obviously that it's CN's main freight route, and that's why we didn't include it in any kind of first phase. It would need to be an agreement between CP and the provincial government, so that CP's freight is not disrupted in any way, whether it's moving to a different corridor or adding additional tracks in that corridor. So that's first and foremost to make that work.
But hey, stop. And one of the things you don't talk about, at least that I didn't read, is safety. We spent millions of dollars diverting freight traffic around whatever that town was where we had the derailment.
Yeah.
And similarly, in Calgary and other places, why does it make sense to be shipping freight trains, particularly either, freight trains with oil or dangerous goods right through the annex and through the center of Mississauga and the center of Toronto? And people say, well, it's never going to happen. 1978, the largest peacetime evacuation in Canadian history was on that line.
No, I mean, that's true. And certainly freight trains are in general a very safe way to transport things. But that line was built, earlier than, say, the CN line, which goes through York Region, which was built, in the 1950s with more spacing from. I mean, I backed onto that line for a number of years. I lived in a house where the trains literally went through my backyard, so I know it well. That's certainly a valid point. That is a valid point.
And what it would do is it would take demand off of Union Station. It would be an express duplication of the Bloor subway. It would get people from Mississauga or Etobicoke to Scarborough and Pickering far quicker than going through Union Station, because you go through the center of the city. I think it makes a ton of sense.
Oh yeah, no, I look, when you look at it, the one problem with this sort of original regional rail network is that it is very radial. It still works for crosstown trips, but we are sending everything through downtown Toronto. That would be a way of getting some of that traffic out of downtown Toronto. If you're going from Scarborough to Mississauga, if this route were available, you would need to go through downtown Toronto. You'd save yourself some time and also reduce congestion on the busiest part of the network.
Then you've got another route that goes up to Millwood and then continues along directly to the east. How's that routing done?
So the green, if you're looking on that map there, the green line is the existing Richmond Hill line.
Right.
But one of the challenges with the existing Richmond Hill line is it really meanders through the Don Valley, and there are a few different ways you could kind of combine it if you had use of that North Toronto line, so that the two lines could interchange, and it could use a somewhat or much more, depending on how you do it, direct route. And it would serve that whole Don Mills and Eglinton area where the Science Center is. There's a lot of office buildings there, so it would be a useful line for sure.
And then you've got the use of this line that goes from Streetsville all the way up through Brampton, and you don't show it here, but it could go all the way up to Orangeville.
That's right. So that's actually a really interesting story, because that track is currently owned by the town of Orangeville and is under discussion for abandonment right now. So preserving that track would cost comparatively next to nothing. But if you ever wanted to replace, if it were abandoned, as is being discussed, and then you wanted to replace it down the line, you're talking billions and billions of dollars. So, I think preserving it so that we could do something like this in the future is really valuable. But the way the line works is it goes, again, if you had full use of that corridor, the Milton corridor, it runs off that corridor from Streetsville. It goes past the Meadowvale Office Park, which is big. It goes, right through the middle of Brampton, goes right to downtown Brampton, and then up up just west of Huron, Ontario. So, or of Highway 10 up there. And so, it's a really useful line that can tie Brampton right into the heart of Mississauga, create kind of, it doesn't replace the Huron, Ontario LRT, but it creates kind of a second route that serves some other parts of the region. Again, kind of a second north-south subway line in Peel region.
Yeah, and Caledon, which is just to the north of the Mayfield stop that you've identified here, is some people think projected to go from 50,000 people to 500,000 people over the course of the next 10 to 20 years. And Mayfield, again, is where, if they ever build this Highway 413, that Highway 413 would go around to service that major growth. And so I think that that's a really interesting idea. You also show it going through Square One. How do you get it from Cooksville up to Square One?
Well, that's sort of one of my favorite ones. And so Square One is obviously it's an enormous development center. It's an enormous concentration of existing development. And it's also Mississauga's main bus hub. So there's a huge advantage to getting all those people on those buses onto the trains directly, rather than having them make one transfer to get to Cooksville and then another transfer to get onto the train. So we had mapping that showed how much travel time it would save for people from various parts of Mississauga. The way that we do it is you would need a short underground segment from basically around Cooksville Station to Square One itself. But that's really short, and only one underground station, which you could even build under the parking lots at Square One, so it'd be fairly easy to dig it out. And then once you get across the 403 has a preserved transit corridor. It's designated for transit use on the north side of the 403 between the highway and the hydro line. And you could use that corridor to get back onto the Milton line by Arundel Station. So, for a short tunnel, suddenly, it wouldn't be worthwhile for 6 trains or 8 trains a day. But if you have a train every 10 minutes or every 5 minutes, it's worth investing in some extra infrastructure to kind of maximize the value. And Square One because it's so close, it seems, the Pearson Airport is another example that way. It seems like it would make sense if you have all this service to maybe divert it to hit the biggest concentration of development.
Makes sense to me. Now it's interesting. This green line that you've got that goes on the eastern side to Richmond Hill doesn't currently go to Woodbridge, and I think it goes. It could go from to Woodbridge and Bolton. What's the proposal there?
So again, this is all about CP and how if CP if we're able to work out an arrangement with CP, and this is why I sort of say in this, to replace these tracks from scratch, if we build them out as a subway, and they'd be a useful subway, it would cost tens of billions of dollars. So it wouldn't be unreasonable to pay a fair bit to add capacity or compensate CP for them to add capacity there or elsewhere, so that their corridors could be used for passenger as well as freight service. And CP is CP's main line currently goes up, through Woodbridge and up to Bolton. So if you could add tracks or shift CP's traffic to a different corridor, you could you could serve Woodbridge and also the northern part of Etobicoke, which is a densely populated community with a lot of heavy development and lower income communities as well, who could really benefit from better transit connections.
So you've got really quite an expansive plan here. You've got the plans to go, electrification, different trains that are single level with lots more exits and entrances. You've got shorter or smaller stations that you say, and you use the example of Ottawa and the example of Germany and France that have got stations that are 1/10 the cost of the stations that we've been building. You show how electrification means that grade separation can be far more easily and cost effectively done. It's a pretty aggressive, expansive, comprehensive report that you've come out with.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, we did a lot of digging and talked to a lot of people. We actually had all the technical aspects reviewed by a few Swiss rail engineers. The Swiss are close to the gold standard at this kind of thing. So they reviewed it and tweaked a few bits of it to make sure we got all the European examples and European technologies right. So there's a lot to learn from, and I think the kind of big picture lesson here is A, there's a lot of potential, but B, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. This has been done in places like Switzerland, like Germany, like France for 50 years, even more. And we can emulate the technologies that they have operating there successfully, and bring them over here because reinventing technologies that have been developed over 50 years is tricky.
What's the key to getting it done? Like, it's so aggressive, and we're spending so much money on the Ontario line and other things already. How do we actually get this implemented?
Well, I think the first step is to come up with a detailed plan. That's one of the things the Swiss told us loud and clear, is you start, in Switzerland, when they're building a line like this, or in Germany or wherever, they start with a detailed timetable. They know years in advance, before they turn the first shovel, this train's going to leave at 8:12, this one at 8:15, this one at 8:17. So then they design the infrastructure to that timetable, basically, and work it out to make that timetable work. So you're not building more than you need to. So you save money that way. The second thing is working out an agreement with the freight railways. I think that's a key issue that has to be resolved to the satisfaction of both.
So one of the solutions on these railway, particularly the CP line that goes through Mississauga, from Milton down on diagonal through Mississauga, and also the Mid-Toronto line that goes between DuPont and Davenport, was to potentially move it up to another line that space was left along the 407 that could take it from the Lisgar station at the northwest corner of Mississauga along the land beside the 407 and connect up with the CP lines that go across the northern part of the city at Bramalea. Does that idea make any sense to you?
Well, that was definitely one of the proposals to shift CP onto that CN bypass that was built in the 1950s. That's certainly a possibility. Additional tracks in the same corridor is a possibility. A third possibility could be to simply use, so CN's line comes up, runs more or less north-south from Burlington through Milton to Georgetown before going east through Brampton. Really, you could take the trains off the CP line in Milton and just put them onto the CN line if there were sufficient capacity to do so. Which would require additional capacity through Brampton, but that's something that is under study. So that does really require sitting down with the freight railways to figure out exactly what they need. But I think those are all viable solutions. Using the existing corridor through Brampton would probably be easier and quicker than building a brand new line through the 407. But again, that would depend on the needs of the freight railways.
But your bottom line is that we've got all these existing railways, this rail network around Toronto that could be far better used for passenger rail than for the currently underutilized freight rail. And that's what's happened in Paris. That's what's happened in London with their, what's it called, overground. And Chicago is looking at that. New York, et cetera, are places that are doing this. This is something we should be thinking very seriously about doing.
Definitely. And 75% of GO's lines roughly are already owned by GO. They've been owned by the province for a number of years, and they have virtually no freight traffic. So on those lines, the challenges are much smaller. But yes, we're copying places that have been doing this for a very long time. It is the best and cheapest way to kind of get, our subway map is, people often say relatively anemic compared to a lot of, say, European cities. This could allow them us to leapfrog them and get up to hundreds of kilometers of equivalent rapid transit, express rapid transit, actually faster and higher capacity than the subway, in a much shorter time and for much less money.
Jonathan English, Director of Transportation Policy at the Toronto Region Board of Trade. Thank you so much for sharing these ideas, both with us, but also far more importantly with the Greater Toronto, if not on Greater Ontario community. I think that it's some radical ideas, but they make sense, and it would transform transit, and it would transform the interconnectivity within the Greater Toronto area. So thank you so much for the role you're playing.
I really appreciate it, and thank you for having me on.
We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Thanks so much. Stay with us.